It is my great pleasure to welcome our guest today, a man with an extraordinary story. For 25 years, he was an officer of the Indian Army and has seen combat and action at close quarters. And then he left the military to start a very, very successful business empire, the chairman of the Radiant Group today. Colonel David, it is a pleasure to have you with us. And you know my soft corner for all things military. So I must, before I ask you about your very successful building of a business empire, ask you about your life in the military. More than 2 decades, a quarter in fact, 25 years, you commanded the Assam Rifles, you have seen combat in Jammu and Kashmir. Tell us a little bit about those years. I know you came from a military background, you married into a military background, and the forge was literally in your blood.
Thank you so much, Barkha, for having called me in here today. And yes, it's been an amazing life and it's been an amazing journey. And 25 years in the armed forces, not a small time. And fortunately, I was commissioned in 1980 after having graduated from the National Defense Academy and the Indian Military Academy. I was commissioned into one of the finest battalions of the Indian Army, the 2nd Battalion of the 8th Gorkha Rifles,
Yes.
which Field Marshal Manekshaw used to call his own.
Yes.
So it was a fine battalion with great additions, and much of what I've applied later in civil life was largely learned in the 4 walls of that lovely battalion of ours, with great additions.
Let me hold you there. A number of soldiers say that the military has been a masterclass for life, and you just repeated that sentiment. You said that whatever I learned in my battalion is really what I applied to life. What is the one leadership skill that you would say that the military in particular taught you that you were able to apply to your business in a very different phase of your life?
Well, the good part, I think, which I did was, Barkha, that I refused to change.
You remained a soldier's soldier.
I remained a soldier even after shedding uniform, because it's very easy to take, a man out of uniform, but it's very difficult to take
uniform out of a
man.
Yes.
So I just decided to remain myself. And so we have remained largely, I think, one of the cultural issues with our group is that we under-promise and over-deliver.
Under-promise and over-deliver.
We say what we mean, we never exaggerate. And we are very conscious about operational delivery of the highest quality. Integrity is a key factor. So these are all important virtues or qualities that we learned while in uniform.
Your focus on employment was also triggered by the kind of conflict zones that you served in, insurgency-prone areas from Jammu and Kashmir to the northeast. What did you find there? Because I know, and I've heard you speaking about this, about the underlying causes for why young men pick up the gun and become insurgents or become militants and, in the worst case, terrorists.
I served extensively in Jammu and Kashmir as well as in Northeast. And in both places, the one common factor I found was that most of the young men didn't have too many options for working, outside and some good source of employment. So as a consequence, there's a lot of unemployment. And when you're unemployed, they say the devil's mind, the idle mind is the devil's workshop.
Yeah.
So it was because of that many of them are now picking up the gun and, going against the government. So that was always in my mind. So when I set up my group of companies, I said, let me try to address this factor. Because all the life, we lived for nationalistic ideals. So we set up the Radiant Group also with that ideal of poverty alleviation by employment generation. And today I feel very satisfied 15 years down the line that we're able to generate thousands of jobs.
I'll get into your sort of business group in a moment from now, but I want to keep the focus on your years as a soldier. I saw this riveting talk by you, and it was called What I Learned from a Terrorist, and where you talk about your experience about what a surrendered how you got to know this surrendered militant, you observed him, and what you took away from that. And this happened, I think, in Jammu and Kashmir, in the Lolab Valley. So if you can talk a little bit about that experience.
There I was the second in command of my unit, and so in that we had to gather some intelligence for the operations. So helping me out in that was a surrendered militant at that point of time. Now a surrendered militant is one, who is hated by the militancy because he is surrendered. And he is therefore, always
he's kind
under
of neither
the
here
support.
nor there.
So he's neither there nor here, and he's, in a kind of twilight zone. But at the same time, he has a lot of information to offer. So it's a very difficult life. I was just looking at him as one human being leading his life. And in the midst of all that, the madness that he was in, he had made sense of it by building a 24-hour capsule. Where he had a bit of physical exercise.
So he built and designed a 24-hour capsule for himself.
For himself, within that.
That's quite a regimental approach, in fact,
yes,
to life.
Which for me was an education, because I said, here's a man who has got very little going for him. And despite that, he's trying to make sense of that by having some morning regulated exercise. And then, every day trying to build some value into what his life is all about, including writing a bit of poetry. So, from that, I drew a lesson, and during my corporate talk, I did mention that, many of us feel as if we are not in the right profession. Because always your profession is not by choice. But you can always make sense of it. And you can create something of value out of it, and be sensible about it, if you approach it appropriately. Like this man who was in the most difficult profession of the world, as a kind of interpreter and, somebody who was giving information, was still making sense of it by building a 24-hour capsule. And I've tried to imbibe that into my own life as well.
And what would he do in these 24 hours, in this capsule?
What
did you, what was this capsule all about? Was it a way of his managing his time better? Was it a way of him still believing that life could offer another opportunity? What was that lesson that you took away, in a sense?
The 24-hour capsule essentially, Barkha, was that in the morning he had built a routine for himself. So he had a time when he used to get up in the morning. That particular time he was always awake. In the morning, the men would play some volleyball. So he'd join them and he'd play volleyball along with them. So that was a bit of physical exercise. His breakfast was always on time. And thereafter, in terms of intelligence, he would have come prepared. That this is what, that I haven't told you all about so far, but I feel this is important. That you all should know about this. So he would give you some information of that kind, which was relevant. There were a lot of new people coming into the unit. So he would tell them that these are the pitfalls and these are the do's and don'ts.
Fascinating.
That you need to work on.
And I could see the audience was quite gobsmacked when you were telling them about this, because, decorated soldier saying, this is what a surrendered militant taught me. But I guess a soldier learns from all experiences.
You learn from all experiences, and, life by itself it's amazing to see these kind of diverse opportunities that one gets to learn from.
So you said in the beginning that everything, in a way, that you learned for the rest of life was learned, as being a man in uniform. One of the most brilliant things that I have observed about the military is how secularism is just a given. You have these multi-faiths, places of worship. In some units, you have the MMG, the Mandir Masjid Gurdwara. You have the commanding officer basically, literally, not just tolerating, but adopting the faith and the festivals of his men. Can you speak a little bit about what we could all learn from the military? Because I know a lot of civilians don't have that exposure. They actually don't know how this works in the military.
Well, I was posted in a Gorkha battalion.
Yes.
And our whole, life was centered around the religious faith of our men. So religion was a part of our life. But what was larger and more important was the way that we
took part in each other.
Took part in we were all integrated as one group of people for a common objective. Like we were trying to fight the militancy, or when we were in peace stations, we were into routine administration. We lived for each other. We were closely integrated as officers and men. So it played a part in our lives, but it was not the key. It just was seamless in our lives.
You didn't have to discuss it and debate it. It was just a given.
It was just a part of it, and we all believed it, along with the men, because that's how we were.
Talk a little bit about this love for the Paltan, as it's called. And I thought of it recently because I saw this movie, which I urge you to see if you haven't, called 1917, which is, of course, set against the backdrop of the World War, where one soldier literally goes on this impossible mission because that's the promise he made to his friend, his buddy. And the buddy gets shot. And it's the last promise that he makes is that what you've asked me to do, I will do. And having had the privilege of seeing men in action, I know how much that love for the Paltan, that loyalty to the Paltan drives men in uniform. And I want our viewers, many of whom don't have that opportunity, to understand that.
Well, love for the battalion is everything. I personally feel, even ahead of patriotism, what really drives men to do what they do in battle is the love for the battalion. Every unit has got a reputation, it has a name.
Yeah.
Which has been built on the shoulders of so many earlier generations of soldiers and officers who have done their best for the unit. So during the course of your span in the unit, you don't want anything to happen that would sully that name of the battalion. And particularly when you are in operations, it's an opportunity. It's a great opportunity to now further enhance the history of that unit.
Yeah. It's a matter of izzat and honor.
Yeah. It's a matter of honor. And so therefore, those of us who served in the battalion, and particularly older battalions with a huge amount of traditions, we are overawed by the sense of responsibility that is there on us to further enhance and build the name of the unit.
Now, as someone who grows up as, the son of an army officer, then joins the military yourself, as I said, marries the daughter of an Air Force officer, how do you take this difficult emotional decision to leave the military? I know that it was in part guided by personal reasons or personal circumstances, but it's very tough to make that decision. How did that come to happen for you?
That's an interesting question, Barkha. Actually, in my course, everybody felt I was the last man who would ever leave the army and that to get into entrepreneurship. Because I was so much into the army myself. But then what happened was it was also a force of circumstances, and something else happened. I commanded 2 battalions and I was commanding a training center, and I was really taken up by this aspect of commanding a unit. And the most difficult thing for me was to hand over that unit which I was, commanding to
someone else.
Now to the next successor. Yeah. So this was really, in many ways it was hurting me. And now I was into the command of a training center. Again, it was a very, very nice experience. So I would always remark to my wife, Renuka, that, this is something I'm not liking. And somehow entrepreneurship seemed to offer an option where, suppose I set up something on my own.
Yeah. You'd feel like you've created and molded something again.
I could build it, and I could be a part of it as long as I was relevant. To be a genuine leader, I could continue to drive it. So that was one of the very important reasons as to why I chose entrepreneurship and not a job after leaving uniform. Leaving the uniform at that point became a little important because my father, who was a former military officer, I had not really looked much in his direction because I was, in the exigencies of service. I realized that he was a diabetic and he was in need of attention. So I wanted to take good care of him. And by then I had already done most of it that people love to do. That's command 2 battalions, as also a training center. So I felt that, given these circumstances, it would be a good thing to now move out and try and strike out on my own.
So when you do leave, you come up with this idea, which is very novel for its time, of cash management services, of providing basically your experience of having dealt in operations and security to the movement of cash. Can you explain to people who may not know what exactly that entailed and how did this idea strike you? Because that is where your entrepreneurship or your journey as an entrepreneur begins.
True. Normally, you always like to pick up something that is in alignment with what your earlier training has been. So when I came out at that point of time, I decided to take up something that I would be more comfortable with. So at that time, I realized that there were any number of man-guarding services, but companies at that point of time. But in terms of cash logistics, organizations, there were hardly any. There were just about 3 in the country. So I realized that it was a high entry barrier business. It was zero-error logistics. Cash logistics essentially means transportation of cash from the currency chest to the forward dispersal areas like banks and other outlets, and also retrieving the cash from places where it is being picked up like malls and insurance outlets and maybe mobile telephone outlets and so on, bring all back into the vaults. So it's a cycle, the currency cycle, and also loading of ATMs is an important part of it. So in that there were very few companies. At that point there were only 2 really relevant companies. So I felt that it's a good thing to enter this field.
So it was not a very crowded space.
Not much of competition. And at the same time, it was high entry barrier. It needed a strong spine to drive this business because it is fairly risky. So,
how did your experience as a soldier come into play in this entry into the private corporate sector?
The good part that happened was that I chose most of my colleagues from the services, who were former service colleagues, to help me out. And so therefore, and then this is also a zero-error business because public money is involved.
Yeah.
So it had very strong standard operating procedures. It had gunmen, it had drivers, very hard.
So in a way, it was like an operation only.
So it was just that we had put away our radio sets and picked up mobiles. And I really didn't find much of a difference, in the type of work that we were doing.
And your business catapulted and grew very successfully. But you make a very interesting point about picking up for employment your former colleagues. I want you to speak a little bit about why the private sector, before I come back to your journey, has not been able to create these spaces, in particular for Indian Jawans, who are, obviously have to retire because of reasons of fitness, and you need an agile and fit and young army well before their prime. And then suddenly you hear all of these stories about these men having nowhere to go. And I know that this is a passion for you, and I think you've tried to create space for them in your organization. So speak a little bit about that.
We have over 1,000 men who are ex-service in our organization. Of course, based on competencies, like where banking competency is required, we have to take people from that sector. But otherwise, Barkha, I personally feel that the private sector is really lost out because this is a truly very well-trained workforce that is available.
I mean, they can create a bridge over floods. They have just created in Manesar overnight a quarantine center for the coronavirus people who have been evacuated from China. This is something only the army can do. So I'm just amazed that they're not used more, and I'm so happy that you're doing that. Now, in this new avatar, you also decide that it's never too old to study again, and it's never too old to learn again, and you go to Harvard, and you basically are ready in a way to start from scratch again. So speak a little bit about how that happens, and for a CEO, for a commanding officer to become a student again, what does that experience feel like?
Well, actually, I realized that I was becoming very successful in business, but I didn't have any formal education, in business. So that's when I started looking around, and the Harvard Business School was then running the owner-president management program, where if your business had a certain turnover, then you could be part of a class as an owner or as the president of a company. And they would also, understanding the fact that because most of the very successful business titans, normally are not having a business background. So it was a process of re-educating them and telling them about the best practices globally. So I found this, so I wrote to Harvard Business School, and they were kind enough to enroll me. So this was a 3-year program, of which there was a certain segment, which was the contact segment, where we lived in Harvard campus. And
for a man accustomed to giving orders, how was it to have having someone else be the boss at least in the classroom?
Well, I just became a student, but I had no options, because Harvard professors don't brook any nonsense from anyone. So to that extent, it was an amazing experience, and there was as much in-class learning as it was outside the class. Because all my classmates were very successful entrepreneurs in their own right. Some of them, a couple of them were near billionaires. So,
and you go from creating this very successful cash management services business to then saying, okay, this group needs to diversify. It needs to get into spaces that it hasn't gone into before. And so at what point do you decide on that diversification? And now you're entering uncharted waters, because at least with the cash management, there is some security dimension.
Yeah. Well, see, 2008, you're familiar.
Yes.
The recession happened.
Yes.
And one thing I observed was groups which were based on
cash.
Just one line of business.
Yeah.
They were the most vulnerable.
Yeah.
So I felt it's better to diversify the platform. So in alignment, by then we had offices all over the country. So in alignment with that, I decided to set up 2 other businesses which could lean onto these offices. So that is how the man guarding services business came into being, and also the Radiant Medical Services, which provides home health care. So that we kept in a regional configuration in the south. So these 2 businesses I set up, and on return from Harvard, I quickly made use of my contacts, because many of them were requiring outsourced services. My own classmates.
Yeah.
So we set up 2 companies, that is the Radiant Integrity Techno Solutions and the Radiant Global Solutions, both of them providing important services to their requirements.
And I have to ask you this, because you've gone from life as a soldier, and life in the barracks is a simple life. It's an elementary life, right? And you also grew up in that middle class way, and then you come into self-made wealth. How does that change you and your values? Does it at all? And how do you keep your core values as a Fauji intact when you suddenly have all this success and all this money?
Well, till the age of 45, I was earning 30,000 rupees a month. That was my last salary as a colonel in the army. So maybe I was too old a dog to learn the tricks.
No, but seriously, I mean, it must have had it must have been a shift in your life, to have lived a certain way all your life and then...
Fortunately, the children also were part of that. Yes, there is, unfortunately, in our country today, when you are successful, and there are certain, visible aspects of it, which come along with that. And unfortunately, I found that earlier I had only a battered Indigo Merino for a long time. So then when I found I had to drive a CEO of a bank along with me in that, he was extremely uncomfortable having a conversation with me.
Yeah.
You'd be constantly looking at the staff, wondering whether he was talking to the right man. So, in the corporate sector, these are all instruments,
Sure.
which unfortunately, strategic instruments.
Sure.
Whether you are on a chartered aircraft, or you're, driving a good vehicle. So the conversation can go on seamlessly, and these are not, irritants.
I understand. And having now built this successful sort of set of companies, you are returning to your first love, which is the military, and you are actually getting into the publishing space with a military affairs devoted journal plus website, Medals and Ribbons. What spurred this on?
Actually, it was we've been thinking of publication for some time. What really impelled me was something that happened. I belong to the 56th course of the National Defense Academy. And at this point of time, all the three chiefs of the Army, Air Force and Navy, all three of them are from the same course.
That's right.
The 56th course.
Which is your course.
It's a very rare occurrence, because only the first course of the National Defense Academy, all the three chiefs were from the first course, and now it's happened after so many courses. And all three happen to be good friends of mine. So when I looked at the entire spectrum of the different publications on offer, I felt that there should be one publication which presents the defense forces, which essentially is all about, as I said earlier, a matter of honor, and the pride and the glory that it represents. So that's how we chose the masthead of Medals and Ribbons.
And will it be a platform for ex-servicemen or for serving officers or any issue related to the military? What is at its heart or core plan?
Anything that is declassified, that can be covered in this magazine. And essentially, there are a lot of human interest stories.
Yes.
Of young officers, young ladies now, fighter pilots. It's an amazing armed force that we have.
Yes.
And every year I find in India today, when they ask us to which is that one bastion that the people really love,
it's still the military.
It's always the armed forces.
Always.
So they do need a voice, I feel. A magazine that can connect to the body public, and at the same time it will also have some value in the reading rooms of the serving soldiers and the serving fraternity. So it's going to be a mix of that, and it's being put together by Lieutenant General J.S. Sandhu, who was, earlier, he's a very highly reputed military officer, a very fine officer, and who also happened to be my roommate when I was in Young Officers, so I know him that well. And he's been a man of letters earlier. He writes very well, he speaks well. So he's going to be the chief editor of this magazine.
Fantastic. Congratulations. I have to ask you in the end, what was the toughest thing about being a soldier that stays with you, that you would advise young people today? And I ask you this in particular because despite all the faith in the military, the romance around it, the respect for it, we are seeing a shortfall of officers in the military. And it's very important to get young people interested and reignited again in the military. So the last question, the toughest thing about being a soldier and your most precious memory, both.
The most precious memory I have about soldiering has been the love of the men. Because they were simple men with simple ambitions, but in many ways they were role models. Because you learn that with so little you could still be so
happy,
so completely happy, completely satisfied, with a sense of purpose. So I always pray that their simple ambitions and whatever, their thoughts that they had, they always realized in the years ahead. Many of them give up their lives so easily without a second thought. So that's, I think, the most valuable takeaway which I have from the military. I'm in a very proud part of it. That's the most important part of my life. The best years of my life up to the age of 45. I was in uniform from the age of 16. So now what I'm doing in corporate life, I would say is a blessing from God. It's just an amazing thing that happened. I never expected. I just wanted to lead where I could drive something independently, but I never expected it to grow the manner that it has.
And the toughest thing about being a soldier?
Toughest thing about being soldier is handing over your command.
That still hurts. I can relate to that. But you built your own empire,
Yeah.
and congratulations. It was a pleasure talking to you, sir.
Thank you very much.